In this video, you'll understand why choosing the right way to access your retirement pot is important and how it's vital not to get lured into taking your tax-free cash as soon as possible. And what I found particularly interesting and counterintuitive is that what is presumed to be a more tax-efficient strategy can turn out to be the least tax-efficient, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Later on, I'll show you how using up the tax-free cash from your pension could be a big mistake that costs you and perhaps your heirs tens of thousands of pounds. But if you have no idea what I'm talking about, it's probably because you missed my previous video where I explained the different ways you could withdraw money from your pension pot. But don't worry, here's the link, so watch it, come back and I'll show you something quite interesting and perhaps something you haven't quite thought of before. So let's get to it. When you retire with a defined contribution pension pot, you're left thinking how to take cash from this pot. Two popular ways are the Flexi-Access Drawdown, or FAD for short, and Uncrystallized Funds Pension Lump Sum, or UFPLS for short. But how different would the results be? Well, one way to find out is to look at a scenario. Say you have a pension pot of 500k and a growth rate of 5% for both the pension pot and the drawdown pot, and the average inflation rate is 3% per year. Say the withdrawal target is 20k annually after tax. If someone aged 55 retires now and dies at 85, this gives 30 years of retirement. Under the withdrawal method known as UFPLS, 25% of the pension pot withdrawals are tax-free and the other 75% is taxed as income. Remember, you still have your personal allowance of £12,570 to use as well, so in theory you could withdraw £16,760 a year tax-free under UFPLS. Therefore, to get to £20,000 of annual income after tax, you will need to take £20,572. If you want to check the math, remember my previous video where I actually went through it. Now, under FAD, you can start using just the tax-free cash portion of the pension pot. This is achieved by taking some money out of the pension pot, also known as crystallization, and from that crystallized amount, take the tax-free cash portion and move the taxable portion into a drawdown pot where it is reinvested. So in this FAD scenario, the strategy involves taking as much tax-free cash as possible together with your personal allowance to pay the least tax possible at the beginning. So as you can see, to get a 20k post-tax income under UFPLS, you need to withdraw and use £20,572, but with the FAD method, you only need to use up 20k because of course it's tax-free. This strategy at first glance seems to be the most tax efficient, meaning you would pay the least tax, but as I am going to show you, that's not true. To illustrate this, I created a model to simulate both withdrawal methods under the scenario mentioned previously. This is how much tax you would have paid under each method, and surprise, the FAD is the least tax efficient method because you end up paying more tax. But how could that be? We just showed how much more tax efficient it was. Let's investigate this a little bit more. First, let's take a look at what the wealth would be like under both methods. And here's the graph. What you can see is that they both start at 500k, but the FAD grows more than the UFPLS. Why? Well, it's kind of obvious if you think about it. Remember earlier I showed you that if you want 20k post-tax income, you only need to take 20k under FAD, but 20,572 under UFPLS. So the less you take, the more you leave in the pots, and the additional money left behind keeps on compounding. So looking at the gap between the two, you can understand why it initially widens, but at some point it narrows down again and all the way down until the end where FAD still slightly comes out ahead by 1k. So somewhere along these curves, something must have been drawing down more from the FAD wealth, and you guessed it, it's tax. Is it true? Let's see the monthly tax paid under each method in this graph. Now, you can see under the FAD method, you basically pay zero tax until 2038, and that's when your tax payments jumped massively because you've exhausted all tax-free cash. And now you have to draw from your drawdown pot, which is fully taxable. On the other hand, UFPLS is chugging on steadily, paying a little more tax every time, but still getting 25% tax-free because there's still money in the pension pot, as the latter has been growing all along. Oh, and if you wonder why these lines keep rising, it's because the withdrawal rate has been adjusted for inflation over time. Under FAD, the money you have moved into the drawdown pot can still grow, but there's no tax-free cash there. It's all taxable. Visually, you can see this area is the tax save in the beginning under FAD, and this area is how much more you pay later. Therefore, the difference in area shows how much better or worse off you would be. Visually, you can see that you would have paid more in tax in total under FAD. But why is this the case? Well, by leaving money in the pension pot, that pot grows and therefore tax-free cash also grows. That comes in handy later, of course, and hence why later you pay less tax. On the other hand, by crystallizing the whole pension pot fairly quickly, using up the tax-free cash and moving the excess into the drawdown pot, you lose out on tax-free cash growth that could have happened. So that's why I said earlier the FAD strategy above is not necessarily the most tax efficient way to withdraw your pension money. But you could argue, who cares about how much tax you pay as long as you end up wealthier, and you'd be right, because while you pay more tax, you'd still end up better off under FAD. And generally, that very often seems to be the case. But take this second scenario. It's a slightly bigger pension pot of 650k with a higher withdrawal rate of 35k, that's up from 20k earlier. Now, this seems a bit high for the pension pot, but let's assume your investment grows at 8% per year, up from 5% previously. If you run the simulation again, here's what the results look like. First up, from a total wealth perspective, you would end up better off under UFPLS by about 53k more. Switching to the monthly tax, you can see how there's a pretty wide gap between the two when the tax-free cash is exhausted. At that point, the withdrawal target after tax is over 45k, which means under FAD you would need to withdraw more than 55k, as this puts you in the higher tax bracket of 40%. With UFPLS, because you still have tax-free cash, you would only need about 49k, which keeps you within the basic tax rate bracket of 20%. One thing also to mention is there's a limit on how much tax-free cash you can take in your lifetime, currently set at £268,275, and that's what kicks in later with UFPLS, capping the amount of tax-free cash. Of course, I deliberately chose these values to amplify the impact of taxation, but the point here is you have to be careful with jumping straight for the tax-free cash, because that could cost you more later down the line, and that's the mistake I'm referring to. Now, I have to be clear here, I'm not saying that the problem is with FAD itself, but rather the drawdown strategy, and that's because in theory you could replicate the same UFPLS strategy with FAD. And there you have it. What I found particularly compelling is that Flexi-Access Drawdown may seem more tax efficient, but you actually end up paying more in tax overall. Nevertheless, it's often the better option because your remaining wealth is greater and therefore benefits from additional compounding. However, that's not always true, as we just saw. And more importantly, because the government keeps changing the rules, what may be true one year may not necessarily be true the next year. And that's why you have to actually run the numbers to verify. That's it from me. I hope you find this insightful. If you did, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.